Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started. This morning's topic is remote auditing 1 year later. So just a couple of items before we go ahead and get started this morning, some introductions and housekeeping. My name is Scott McDonough. I'm the Director of Sales and Global Marketing with Smithers Quality Assessments Division. You'll notice that chat has been disabled for this webinar, but please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel to submit your questions, and we will answer those after the presentation. Once you exit the webinar today, a brief survey will appear. Certainly appreciate your feedback, as it does help inform future presentations that we bring you. So a little bit about our speaker today. Aaron Troshenitz, General Manager, North America, Smithers Quality Assessments. Over his nearly 20-year career, Aaron has split equal time between the manufacturing and certification industry sectors, crossing over them on 3 separate occasions. This unique crossover experience is something that has provided Aaron with an immense amount of perspective for what truly works in the real world, as well as has instilled in him a constant pursuit for operational excellence. In manufacturing, Aaron evolved from a machining production supervisor of UAW hourly employees into leading major environmental quality initiatives such as ISO 9001 and 14001, and ISO TS 16949 implementation, and later into special vendor recovery assignments, as well as major platform program launches. In certifications, he has led the largest aerospace certification services company in the world, delivered new certification programs ranging from IT to food sectors, as well as been responsible for overall growing business profitability while maintaining associated operational costs. Aaron also maintains active certifications as an American Society of Quality Certified Manager, Organizational Excellence, and Certified Quality Auditor. He has auditor credentials, which include automotive, environmental, aerospace, and medical device, as well as supporting lean, project management professional, 6 Sigma certifications and trainings. In his current role as GM North America for Smithers Quality Assessments, Aaron has been charged with specifically delivering the organizational supporting structure and business growth programs to realize a 3-fold increase in the business in the next 3 years, which he is intent on meeting through a series of business growth initiatives well underway. And with that, Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott, for the introduction. Let me just pull up my deck here. Okay, everybody seeing that all right? Okay. So as Scott mentioned, this morning's session, remote auditing 1 year later. This is a session certainly we've been looking forward to putting together for folks, because it has been a unique year, to say the least, as we've learned and grown with remote auditing. So a couple of topics that we'll go through. I think it's really important we kind of set the scene. So I have a forward kind of on some thoughts with remote auditing in general. We'll talk about some of the observations that we've seen with remote audit. We actually did a survey with remote audit, a voice of the customer type activity, reaching out to client organizations, asking them what they thought about the effectiveness of remote audit. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll kind of conclude with what do we see as potentially the future of remote audit. There is still a lot to be determined from an accreditation oversight perspective on remote audit, but we'll talk about what we see as the potential path forward involving remote audit. So a little bit of a forward. So back in 2020, for those of you that were able to attend our virtual quality conference, we were about 3 to 4 months in remote audit, certainly learning very quickly in real time as to what remote audit involved, what were some of the trainings we needed to do with folks, what were some of the tips and tricks with remote audit, and really setting our learning curve in real time. We were all trying to work together, clients, auditors, and certainly oversight. And I think in the last 12 months, we've certainly learned a great deal with remote audit. But as is the case with any type of tool, there are some potential positive as well as negative aspects to keep in mind, certainly with remote auditing techniques. This discussion that we're about to have this morning is intended to be completely honest and transparent. The good, the bad, the ugly, if you will. Because I think there are some very positive aspects as well as some concerns, frankly, that we need to talk about, things we've observed with remote audit and things that need to be considered as we go into the future. So this is kind of a summary, some of our observations with remote audits. So the first piece of this is remote audits by the numbers. So since January of 2020, Smithers has done roughly 600 remote audits. In the April-May timeframe, much like all CBs, that was kind of the high point, and you can see this on the right. That's where we had the heaviest traffic as a percentage of our audits overall being remote. And that was obviously at the height as far as some pandemic activity with our clients, things we were seeing, moving things around. So it's no surprise that's continued to kind of be the high point that we saw. We were running, just to put some perspective on that, we were running 8 to 10 times higher with remote audit for a sustained 2-month period. So I credit a lot of what we learned, I think, in that time frame, because there was so much volume of it. It just came down to the reality that if we were going to conduct an audit, it was more than likely overwhelmingly going to be done via remote with what was going on. Now, we have since seen remote audits start to level off. Initially, this came down to about 30 to 35% as a percentage of our audits overall. We're now starting to approach somewhere around 15 to 20% of our audits overall. And I think it's probably going to level out there for a little while, but I would, continue to foresee that it'll dip even a little bit below that in all likelihood. So some additional comments. So some realities with remote audit. So remote audits are not a good fit for every client, every standard, every auditor. And I just throw out a couple of considerations. What we've seen with some remote audits that have maybe been more challenging is maybe the clients are too paper oriented with records, which really places a lot of stress on the remote audit technique, because then you're scanning things outside the office. I've even observed audits where we're trying to hold paper records up to the camera, and the auditor's trying to, see what, is being looked at. So certainly if a client organization is, we'll call it more paper record oriented, it can place a lot of difficulties with doing a remote audit. Second consideration, standards. So some standards, such as IETF 16949, and we've observed this as well, may be too inclusive of sector-specific type requirements and demand a closer review of processes in person. When you consider with IETF, you have FEMAs, you have MSA, control plans. Those can be difficult to audit via remote. And we've certainly seen that, as well as collected that feedback from our auditors. And then the last consideration, and again, this is just meant to be honest and transparent, some auditors are not as technologically adept with remote audit techniques. We've seen some auditors that have hit the ground running, very adept at the Zoom platform, able to adapt their audit techniques appropriately. Others have struggled, to be quite honest. So that is a consideration. Some auditors may not be better suited for remote audits, and some auditors have even told us, and this should be no surprise, they do not intend to continue doing remote audits. So all considerations. So some additional items. Initially with remote audits, there was a prevailing thought, and again, completely honest and transparent, additional time would be required because additional planning, perhaps, longer to take samples, things of that nature. However, we haven't seen, virtually in most cases, there's been no additional time added whatsoever. So that has been a bit of a surprise to us. The next consideration is that is not completely clear But we do have some isolated sources, one being aerospace, that the non-conformance activity overall is significantly less with remote audits. And when we say significantly less, we're talking of upwards of 60% less NCRs or non-conformances issued during a remote audit versus an on-site activity. So that is a consideration and certainly something to pay attention to. And then the last item thought I would offer is from our collective experience with remote audits, there's really three essential keys when it comes to the effectiveness of the remote audit activity. And that the first being effective auditor pre-planning, very, very important. How well has the auditor planned any of the technological considerations? How well does he or she understand what they're walking into with the client in terms of the client's platform, their system, what they're about to see? So very important. Two is securing a technology platform that can be effective. Sometimes, we're told to use the client's platform, may not be stable. We may have access issues. The auditor is obviously not familiar with it. So that technology platform is a critical key. And then I would say the third is the auditor's ability to truly adapt, because it is a different way to audit. And I myself, I've done remote audits. I find myself auditing differently as a result of being in a virtual environment. It's just a reality. And if you're not able to do that and you think you're going to audit virtually the same way you would in person, you're going to see some challenges associated with that audit. So as I mentioned, we did a voice of the customer survey. It was actually a great activity that the marketing team helped support with us. So we facilitated, everyone I'm sure is familiar with the Survey Monkey. So we did a Survey Monkey, and this was again specifically intended to examine different aspects of remote audit effectiveness. We'll talk about the different lenses we look through that. The Survey Monkey was also shared across a larger CV audience. We have an association through a group called the Independent Association of Accredited Registrars, or IAAR. That's got about a membership participant of 30 CBs at this time. So that was able to get our respondent numbers up by having them send it to their clients as well. So we ended up with about 800 respondents, which for a survey of this type of nature is a pretty significant number of folks providing inputs into it. And we also made an attempt, and I think it's pretty close in terms of correlation, but it's just a different data point to consider of trying to extract any of the data that would have been SQA client specific versus non-SQA client. So we can kind of look at it through, okay, these are our clients, what they're saying. This is the overall audience of all clients for all the different CBs involved that would have participated in it. So as you can see on the right here, overwhelming population of organizations was ISO 9001. We did have a few, you see environmental, med device, aerospace, automotive, and then other. So those would be non-traditional type programs. So the first thing we wanted to look at in terms of remote audit was technology issues and their impact on the audit objective achievement. And what was really interesting about this from the client perspective, you can see nearly 75% of overall respondents, and for the SQA clients, it was 80%, so not a huge difference, somewhat marginal, reported no difference in audit objective achievement given any technology issues incurred. So from a respondent standpoint, what that's telling us is they felt even with remote audit, technology platform, if there were technological type issues, that at the end of the day, it didn't stop the auditor, he or she, from achieving their audit objective. And you can see some of the comments here, some of the highlighted items, not surprising. actually find this incredibly more convenient and thorough. People know to be on Teams, easily searchable. Comment 2 is kind of interesting, certainly was way more efficient as there were less distractions. Maybe that respondent felt that it was able to focus more in a remote virtual audit environment as opposed to in person. The third comment obviously goes to the discussion we were having before. If you're more of a, I'll call it a virtually oriented company, online systems, records are accessible electronically. Remote audit can seem like it runs really smooth, provided the audit is conducted effectively, and a lot of the systems lend themselves to it. Fourth item, and we've seen this actually during some of our observations, when it comes to the auditors trying to get a tour of the facility, or certainly any facility-oriented audit trails, depending on the plant's Wi-Fi and that whole situation, it can cause a lot of disruptions and certainly require the auditor to do a number of workarounds to continue to do a remote audit technique. So that was a comment that certainly we've seen through observations, and we've gotten that feedback from auditors in some cases. But in terms of the overall result, 75% again, respondents, no issue as far as audit objective achievement with remote audit versus on-site. So the next voice of the customer lens we want to look through is auditor competency. Frankly, how competent are our guys or gals with using audit techniques remotely? How competent are they with the technology platforms required? So this was very interesting. And you can see the result didn't vary for SQA versus non-SQA respondents. 90% of respondents reported auditor arrived at audit with all the necessary competencies to support the audit. And we felt it was important to ask that question very specifically as it pertained to arrived at the audit, because we do realize some of our auditors, if they're using a new technology platform, may be fluent in it, let's say, by the end of the audit, but how effective and competent were they at the beginning of the audit with conducting the activity they need to with using various technology platforms. But from a respondent view, again, 90% arrived at the audit with all the necessary competencies. So some highlighted comments again, very thorough and proficient way of performing the audit. Auditor made it easy for us, had all the tools necessary. Auditors are well prepared for the virtual platform. A best practice, certainly exchanging phone numbers in case there's any kind of outage experienced or major setback with the technology platform. So that was noted. That was good to see. This one was kind of interesting, ludicrous to think a remote audit of a management system is anything other than the check the box activity. So that's something to take note of. There is some of that perception out there when it comes to remote audits. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. However, that is something certainly to be cognizant of, is that we don't want to make it a check the box type activity. The next item, kind of getting into the technology area. So, if you have facilities, and when I say facilities, plural, using different technology, that can present some challenges. And certainly from the auditor's perspective, being fluent in all the technologies and conducting the activity effectively. So that's a consideration. And the last one, audit was handled in an excellent professional manner. All digital documentation flowed fast. Again, if you're a more, we'll say, virtually oriented electronic records organization, it can lend itself well to conducting the remote audit activity. So that was a comment not altogether unexpected. So the next item, and we had a lot of concerns in this area, and again, honest and transparent. We wanted to look at, from the customer, the client's perspective, what is remote audit impacts on non-audit time? And what that is saying is by choosing or being required to do an audit remotely, are we seeing an increase with non-audit time type activities? That could include breaks. That could include if there's setbacks, again, with the technology platform, take longer than 15 minutes. Now we're up to half an hour. Because quite frankly, and especially earlier on, we did see through observations of auditors, because we did a number of witness audits, that there were issues in this area. So we want to collect that feedback from the respondents. Respondents as a whole, as you can see, 70%, and their close correlation point there, SQA at 65, reported no difference with non-audit time during remote audit. Some highlighted comments to consider here. Remote audit was much more effective with way less downtime for the auditor and our staff. For surveillance audits, they should always be remote. This is obviously the view from the respondent. I understand that new or renewal audits, I assume they're referring to new or recertification, might be better on site, but surveillance remote audits would be much more efficient. Certainly, some people have that view out there in regards to remote audits. Much information was requested prior to the audit. This made for more time in the audit, much easier and efficient, sending files, flow was much better. I think this comment goes back to what we talked about before. A lot of it hinges on the audit pre-planning and making sure that all that information is getting exchanged, that the auditor needs to understand what they're walking into. The more that you can do, the better. It's certainly an essential key for remote audits. Time normally, this one was kind of interesting. Time normally used to physically escort the auditor from one area to another was not needed. So some small 5-minute breaks between some areas, not all, less than 10%. So, just like we absorb time in different ways using remote, you have to consider you absorb time differently with being on site. So that was an interesting perspective. And this comment, we talked about this quite a bit with remote audits, even going back a year ago. We had a few more breaks as we needed to stretch from sitting at the computer. That's real. We are human. We need to get up, stretch our legs periodically. I think that was something we had to learn. Certainly auditors, clients, everyone. Also had more time for report writing during the audit, as with virtual auditing, items are discussed and viewed more quickly. The report writing is a little concerning because obviously we don't want that to detract from auditing, but certainly with those efficiency gains, auditors may be able to spend a little bit more time taking their notes, organizing the report documents. So the next lens we wanted to look through was remote audit impact on identification of concerns, nonconformances. Again, I'll go back to the data point, and this is a real data point. It was actually shared with us from the aerospace industry that they are seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of greater than 60% less nonconformances for remote versus on-site audits. So that is a data point that they are able to collect and put together from OASIS, because obviously we put all that nonconformance activity in the system. So that's an industry perspective. So we wanted to ask the client perspective out in the field, so to speak. What do you think? What do you see from your perspective? So this was interesting. More than 80% of respondents reported no difference in the auditor's ability to identify concerns, nonconformances during remote audits. So from the respondent's view, that's a pretty large number, obviously. No difference being if that individual were on site versus remote, I think that they would have the same level of nonconformance or concern activity regardless. So some highlighted comments here. I believe that some parts of the audit which rely on documentation mainly are great from remote audits. Some areas though, such as actual product manufacturing, should be done on site. I will tell you that second comment there, I think we still have a lot of growth to do with how to do remote audits effectively in production. If we're completely honest with ourselves, I think we still have some additional experience and competency, frankly, that we need to build in that area. Because we have observed that again, auditing in production, it should be no surprise, is at times a huge challenge with remote audits. The second item, and this again is something that we've monitored ourselves, we've seen, it should be no surprise. Auditor was not as easily able to physically observe shop floors. Electronic portion of the audit was virtually identical, but observing through an iPad had its limitations. And this goes back to an auditor technique type of discussion, but obviously when we first started doing remote audits, we had some tips and tricks for how to audit production areas. We've certainly learned since then that in addition to those tips and tricks, it's important as to who's driving with the iPad or the iPhone in terms of virtually surveying a production area or getting your virtual tour. So, those types of things, again, are still considerations with how we can get better, quite frankly, with remote audit. This comment was interesting. The difference we had with remote auditing is that the devices, cameras used were controlled by our personnel. Auditor could not be as random in their sampling, or perhaps could not see as much of periphery was not available through the lens of the camera. So I think that's a very astute observation and something we have to be considerate with in regards to the integrity of the audit and us having a full picture with our sampling techniques and what we see throughout the audit. But nonetheless, having said some of those comments, 80% of respondents reported no difference in the auditor's ability to identify concerns, nonconformances with remote versus on-site. So the last piece of this is that we did want to look at it in terms of overall effectiveness. So at the end of the day, what do we think from a respondent, again, a field perspective with client organizations, what do they think the remote audit effectiveness is versus past on-site audits? And this number was kind of surprising. I did not expect it to be this high, but nearly 80% of respondents reported no difference to significant gains. And that's important because that's a positive. That's saying they actually think the remote audit gave them additional gain in terms of effectiveness with remote audit versus previous on-site audits. That's a large number. I did not think the number, frankly, was going to be that high. You could argue there's probably some considerations that maybe put some bias into that number with, what advantages the clients have with remote in terms of saving on travel costs, perhaps going to the lesser non-conformance activity potentially. But what it is in terms of a number is 80% of clients feel that once again, it's no difference to either some or significant gain with remote audit. And some highlighted comments here, we'll just kind of run through. It felt like there were a lot more efficiencies and the auditors were able to be more thorough, a lot easier for them to take notes, click pictures, get things digitally. Literally zero lag because everyone is online sharing and no need for us to stop and wait for auditors to collect evidence. It is so much more smooth. So going back to the comment of the organization, how virtual they are, how electronic they are, that can be a factor. Some organizations are much more adept than others in terms of supporting a remote audit activity. This comment, the next one we have here, perhaps efficiency would be a better word than effectiveness, which was kind of interesting. We've been through 3 major audits using remote technology during the pandemic, and it took significantly more effort to provide the requested documents than a normal on-site would have required. Not sure why, obviously, but I'm sure there are other client organizations that have had that impact as well, you know, in terms of remote audits and how it's affected their audit activity. Third comment, there is a lack of being able to observe processes well. And this goes back to the shop floor type discussion. We've been through, observe processes well with virtual auditing that you get when you are in person. And certainly we have more peripheral view. When we're in person, we're able to focus our attention on certain things. And there's obviously no risk that we're being led certain ways with in terms of what we're being shown via, again, an iPhone, an iPad, or whatnot. So this kind, I feel that virtual audits are good for surveillance, but research should be done on site when possible. And that was a pretty common remark that we heard in a couple of different areas of the survey. We talked about one already. So there were quite a few people with that feedback. And then the last item was I could pull up information quicker due to the fact that I was at my workstation, which is something to consider. If the organization is electronic and oriented, is virtual in terms of how they support their teams. The reality is remote audit could be quicker. It's not to say it's more effective, but it could be quicker in terms of getting all that information. So some key takeaways before we leave this voice of the customer survey. So certainly from the standpoint of the overall survey results, from a client perspective, from a client perspective, the voice of the customer survey clearly supports from their perspective that audits can be done in terms of competencies, audit achievement, management of non-audit time, issuance of potential concerns, non-conformances effectively. From that field perspective, the data shows that. However, I think when you go within the comments, it still shows there's more that needs to be done in some specific areas. And I named a few here: audit pre-planning, audit techniques with production shop floor areas, and just the overall use of the audit technologies. Again, that is something auditors have to adapt to. When conducting an audit remotely, you have to change your style up a little bit and use some different techniques to do the audit effectively. And then the last consideration is clearly the respondents, again, this is from the field, as a whole see some application of remote audit not only being effective, but more, I think this is important, more convenient in how we conduct our services with them. And that was a really interesting data point to consider. Certainly, we want to maintain the integrity of what we do, but we also have to be considerate to lending ourselves to be easy to work with in terms of audit activities and what we do for our clients. That was a major theme: convenience. It's more convenient for me. That came out of the survey. And certainly a number of comments supported that in different areas. So all that being said, the big question, what is the future of remote audit? So let's talk about that a little bit. So some industry schemes have already indicated that as the pandemic hopefully continues to subside, that an overall return to on-site audit requirements is likely. I will share with you, we've had that discussion with the aerospace sector. They are telling us very clearly that they expect on-site requirements, remote audit guidance that's under COVID right now, to be thrown out and scrapped as we move into 2022. That is their expectation. Automotive has given us some mixed signals, quite frankly, that there may be some combination of remote audit, but I think automotive, you have to keep in mind, was really the last one to allow for remote audit across all the different sectors with third-party conformity assessment. So I think the overall likelihood is they too will go to predominantly on-site requirements, certainly with sites involving production, especially. So that is kind of the signs that we're seeing right now. However, we do expect there to be some application out there for remote audit being made available. within these industry schemes, especially for organizations that have gone virtual. And we see examples like, for instance, with OEMs allowing a number of, we'll call them indirect or non-direct production folks, allow them to work remote. So obviously that in turn is going to affect our ability to go on site and interview those people. So I do think there's some adapting to that reality as organizations go virtual. We too will have to find a way to follow suit with having some virtual nature with our audit activities as well. And there is some stakeholder consensus that performance-based application, we can talk a little bit about that for remote audits, may be possible with what we've learned, especially over the last year. So what that essentially is saying that if the organization is maintaining a certain performance level with key performance indicators or metrics, maybe a remote audit technique is appropriate. We know they're performing well. What's the need to go on site? So there are some of those discussions in the background as well. With non-industry schemes, and we're again honest and transparent, if we think of ISO, we do not foresee a full curtail of remote auditing happening, as it's already in existence, and some of you may be aware of this through IFMD4. So essentially the genie is out of the bottle. It's not going back in the bottle. So we foresee that it will continue on the ISO side. However, I think the key important thing as we look at ISO is that we understand there needs to be some risk evaluation input into whether or not remote audit can be effective. And we have led some of those discussions at Smithers, and frankly, we intend to continue to. So I talked a little bit on the first point. We're in those discussions as far as remote audits. We also believe there's still more work to do in auditor training tools, as well as monitoring its performance. And this is another data point that has to be monitored is, non-conformance activity, the overall quality of the audits in terms of the reports we're reviewing for remote versus on-site. And I think that's a key way we have to look at remote audits in whatever capacity they're used moving forward. I mentioned the performance risk evaluation piece. It's largely missing, if we're honest with ourselves right now. The key criteria for remote audits, and SQA is no different than any other CB, is mostly COVID driven. Do we have a COVID concern here that we should be doing it remotely? Well, hopefully as the pandemic continues to subside, that will no longer be obviously a consideration for remote audit. So what is the consideration or considerations that should be factored into whether or not an audit can be done effectively remote? We think that involves risk criteria. We think it involves performance. So all of those things, frankly, have to be developed for remote audit in the schemes that will allow it. Again, we foresee that will be ISO. So we intend to continue to lead these discussions. We are involved at automotive, at aerospace, at IAF, even ISO, with driving these remote discussions. And we intend to continue to, because frankly, remote audit in some shape or form will continue. I think it has an effective place where it's being used appropriately, but we have some more to learn and grow with it as we move into the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Great presentation. I'm going to go ahead and queue us up for our Q&A. So again, if there's any questions or comments, please feel free to use your Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. I see we do have one that came in during the presentation. Did Smithers do remote audit training for auditors at the start of the pandemic?
That's a great question. And in fact, we did. We actually, our materials were one of the first sets of materials that I think went out for remote auditing. And the reason I think that is, again, going back to that association through the IAAR, we provided our training materials, which was roughly, I think, a 2-hour training with a competency exam attached to it, to the IAAR. And we had a number of members through the IAAR that reached back out to us and said, this is outstanding. Do you guys mind if we steal this? And we said, absolutely, we're all in this together. This is not a competitive situation. So I can actually share with you, we led the development with those materials, not only for ourselves, but others as well.
Thanks, Aaron. We had another question come in from Debbie. Debbie says, thank you. Will a copy of this training be available after this is over? Thank you, Debbie, for attending. We appreciate it. Yeah, in fact, all of the virtual quality conference videos will be available on smithers.com shortly, probably within the next week or two. And once we have those up, we will make sure to send an email out to everybody that registered to make sure they get a chance for it, to see it again. Thanks, Lupita. I appreciate that you liked the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. Here's a question. Are the training materials for auditors be available for customers to use?
That's a good question. I don't see why we couldn't do that. I think I'd want to take a look at those materials to make sure that they're updated, because I mean, they were done 15 months ago. There may be some additional nuggets to put into them, but we can certainly take that request into consideration and see what we can get out to clients. I mean, clearly based on the survey results, there's interest out there and people want to learn more about it. I think we have every interest, again, to be open, transparent with everyone involving remote audits, because I think we're all in this together. If our audits, start to slip as far as the integrity and the results of them, remote audits is not going to stick around. So we need to learn and grow with it and be more effective with it. Again, where it can be applied and where it can be applied appropriately. But we will take that request and let's see what we can do. Scott, we can take that request.
Sure. And for the anonymous attendee who sent that over, I would encourage you to reach out to us via the website. And you can send me a note directly or to info@SQA, and we'll take it from there.
Yep.
Michael asked, when performing process audits, did you run into issues where employees did not want to be recorded with video?
We had some isolated cases, and frankly, we navigated our way around it with allowing the employee to be off camera. But what we really tried to hold the line to, and we continually reinforce with auditors, is we want our folks on camera at all times. I will share with the group, we've incurred issues, and I won't name names, but with their oversight and accreditation friends, where they do not go on camera. And I think what it does is it puts you, when we're being audited, at least by the auditee, it puts you in kind of a psychologically weird place, because you feel they're watching you, but you're not able to watch them. And we never want to do that with our services. So we had a couple of cases where, isolated individuals kindly requested, hey, I don't want to be on camera. Okay, how do we work around this to get around it? But as a general course, everyone should be on camera as part of remote audits.
Debbie asks, is auditing our suppliers remotely to satisfy a supplier development non-conformance allowed?
Yes. Yep. I would tell you, and I just had this discussion with another client, and this is irrespective of scheme. There's not any scheme requirement that I'm aware of that's gone into this whole, you got to go on site with non-conformance follow-up with suppliers, with internal audits. Is what at the end of the day you need to be most concerned about is the effectiveness of doing it remote, and whether it's just the same things we got done talking about that we evaluate from a CB community standpoint. The same apply to clients as well. So you have to take those considerations. And obviously when we go to audit, that will be tested as part of our audit activity.
Thanks, Aaron. Terry asked, what was the percent of AS versus all for the 80% no difference with auditors' ability to identify NCRs?
We haven't sliced that data yet. We tried to get as much of the macro data, but I think that's worth taking a look at. I don't have that number offhand, but just keep in mind the overwhelming portion of the respondents were ISO and ISO only.
Okay, great. John says, thank you for the informative presentation. Thank you, John. Again, appreciate you attending today. Lupita asked, how is the communication protected during the online audit? That's a great question.
That's a great question. And this was something we made a conscious decision with at Smithers, is we do not record anything. And obviously, in terms of transmitting any information, we follow the same protocols when it comes to anything that's classified, ITAR type in nature, is we don't want to be taking in any of those types of things in our systems. So we don't have auditors upload those things in Oasis, in our own internal systems. And we specifically, with those things in mind, made the conscious decision early on with our platform that we would disable the recording function. So with any of our audits using our platform, I can't speak for all the clients' platforms and what they do, but our platform does not allow any recording. So that's one approach we took. I don't know how others have done it, but that was the approach we felt was the most prudent.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. Well, there doesn't appear to be any further. Oh, here we go. Diana, for as long as remote auditing lasts, clients and auditors can use Oasis as a means to quickly transfer documents instead of relying on slower email. Documents can be deleted after review.
It's one way to do it. And again, I think it's all those tips and tricks that we need to consistently make sure that we're getting out there with folks. Early on, certainly when the volumes were really high, we tried to do a lot of communications with our auditors regarding, okay, this guy figured this out, now try it. Okay, this person figured that out, and so on. So I think the more information sharing that we can do, the better. Because again, I think we're all in this together as it pertains to remote audits.